January 9th, 2013 began like any other day in Lowndes High School. Yet, every time I replay that morning in my mind while studying the case file, I cannot escape the weight of what was to come. I am Detective Miller Files, and this is the first chapter of a story that has haunted not only a family but an entire nation. A story surrounded by shadows, unexplained silence, and a timeline filled with missing pieces that never should have gone missing. When I first stepped into the school gym, years after the death of 17-year-old Kendrick Johnson, I felt something unsettling in the air. It is the same feeling any investigator experiences when they enter a place where the truth has been buried for too long. It was not the echo of basketballs, or the faint smell of rubber mats, or even the coldness of the floor. It was the sensation that something had happened there that did not want to be remembered, something that resisted the light. But let us return to the beginning. Kendrick was a typical teenager in many ways and painfully unique in others. He was reserved at times, but energetic with people he trusted. He dreamed of becoming a professional athlete and talked about it often. His friends described him as funny, gentle, and quick to smile. His teachers said he showed respect even on days when he arrived tired from late-night practice sessions. Nothing about his personality or behavior indicated a boy who would willingly bury himself inside a vertical gym mat. That is why the official explanation never sat right with me, even before I began dissecting the evidence. The school's surveillance footage is the last visual record we have of Kendrick alive. The grainy image shows him walking down the hallway that leads to the old gym. His posture is calm and relaxed. He is carrying his books, not in a rush, not looking over his shoulder the way someone would if they sensed danger. Then the footage ends, and the next moments of his life vanish into the abyss. That vanishing point has become a symbol of everything that went wrong in the investigation. I often imagine Kendrick stepping into that gym, the light filtering through the high windows, the sound of sneakers squeaking on wood, the stillness of a room that should have been safe yet somehow became the last place he would ever stand. The tall stacks of rolled-up exercise mats resting against the wall towered like silent columns. Those mats would later become the center of a national debate that still has not reached a satisfying conclusion. The official narrative says Kendrick climbed onto one of those mats to retrieve a pair of shoes he shared with another athlete. Because the mats were stored vertically, the story claims he slipped inside headfirst, became trapped, and suffocated. That was the ruling given by local authorities within days. It was fast, faster than comfort allows, faster than truth allows. But before those conclusions were made public, before the photographs and autopsy reports became subjects of controversy, there was just a mother trying to find her son. On the evening of January 9th, Kendrick did not return home. His parents called his friends, then the school, and finally the authorities. Hours passed without answers. In missing persons cases involving minors, timelines matter. Every minute lost becomes a chasm. Yet no emergency search was launched that night. No immediate lockdown. No urgent sweep of the premises. His mother, Jacqueline Johnson, later told me she felt early on that something was terribly wrong, not just with the disappearance, but with the response to it. The next morning, the gym was filled with the usual noise of students preparing for class. The discovery happened almost accidentally. A group of teenagers walked near the stack of mats, and one of them noticed what they thought was a mannequin inside. It was not a mannequin, it was Kendrick, inverted, motionless, folded into the hollow center of a mat that once stood like a pillar of bright-colored foam. When I examine the photographs from that morning, there is something chilling in the silence of the scene. Kendrick's feet protrude upward as if reaching for a world he could no longer access. His shoes rest loosely in position, not clenched the way a person fighting for breath would hold them. His shoulders appear pinned in a way that raises more questions than answers. His skin tone is darkened from positional blood pooling. These images are not just documentation. They are testimony from a place where no voice survived. Students screamed. Teachers rushed forward. The administrators called emergency services. But Kendrick was long gone. The school placed the building on lockdown, yet the rooms surrounding the gym were not treated as a protected crime scene. Students walked past. Staff walked past. Evidence, if there had been any, could have been altered simply by the presence of so many shoes treading the same floor. It would take years before this oversight became a major point of contention. By then, it was too late. When the paramedics arrived, they pronounced Kendrick dead, and the sheriff's office officially opened a case. I remember reading the initial report and feeling the frustration that many investigators feel when crucial steps have been skipped. The positioning of the mat, the absence of disturbance around its base, the angle of Kendrick's body, all required precise forensic analysis. Instead, assumptions filled the gaps. The first autopsy identified accidental positional asphyxia. The words appeared firm on paper, yet fragile when placed against the physical details of the scene. Breath lost because of entrapment. That is what the conclusion insisted. But it did not account for the bruising pattern on the side of Kendrick's jaw. It did not address the internal findings that were either overlooked or dismissed. It did not answer why a boy of his height and athletic ability would become trapped so quickly that he could not free himself. When I performed my own reconstruction of the possible positions that would lead to such an entrapment, the mechanics did not match the simplicity of the official explanation. The evidence demanded more questions. Instead, the case seemed to shrink toward a convenient answer. This is the turning point where the story stops being merely tragic and becomes disturbing. After the funeral, when Kendrick's body was returned for a second independent autopsy, the family discovered that his internal organs were missing. In their place was newspaper and filler material, a practice that, while sometimes used for preservation after organ removal in autopsies, was never properly documented or communicated. Without his organs, key forensic information was permanently erased. Time of death, internal trauma, subtle hemorrhaging, they were gone. It was as if the truth itself had been scooped out and discarded. When I interviewed the private pathologist who performed the second autopsy, he told me something that stayed with me. He said that the damage on Kendrick's head indicated a blow, not a fall. He said the bruising around the neck was inconsistent with simply hanging inverted. He said that the condition of the body told a story that contradicted the official one. And yet, those findings were ignored. Families seek justice, investigators seek truth, but systems often seek closure, and closure can be lethal when delivered too soon. By now, the community had become restless. Rumors spread about two brothers who were known to have had conflicts with Kendrick in the past. Their father was an FBI agent, which fueled accusations of cover-up. I will not name them here, because accusations without evidence are dangerous. Yet the way the authorities dismissed even the possibility of foul play raised legitimate concerns. Every potential lead should have been explored. Instead, many were brushed aside. The surveillance footage became the next battleground. The grainy cameras scattered throughout the gym complex showed movement but lacked continuity. Frames were missing. Timestamps were inconsistent. One camera froze for over an hour. Another captured students walking, but never captured Kendrick entering the corner where the mats stood. The absence of footage did not prove misconduct, but it created a void that nothing could fill. A void that made the official story weaker, not stronger. In my work as a detective, I have learned that silence can be either innocent or intentional. In this case, it wrapped itself around every crucial moment, like a curtain refusing to lift. The Johnson family continued their fight. They marched, they filed complaints, they demanded federal intervention, and as they did, the world began paying attention. Journalists arrived. Activists arrived. Investigators like me began digging deeper, not because we had answers, but because the story was riddled with flaws that could not be ignored. It is at this point in a case where the line between truth and institutional narrative begins to blur. Accidents do happen. Missteps do occur. But when inconsistencies multiply, and when those in power appear more focused on maintaining a conclusion rather than examining evidence, suspicion becomes inevitable. As I stood in that gym years later, measuring the height of the mats, studying the angles, imagining the desperate struggle of a boy trapped in darkness, something felt wrong. Either Kendrick's final minutes were misunderstood or they were misrepresented. Both possibilities are dangerous. This first chapter ends not with answers, but with weight. The weight of a discovery that was never treated with the seriousness it deserved. The weight of a mother's voice crying out for her son. The weight of a nation asking how a healthy teenager ends up dead inside a school gym mat, while cameras look away and officials rush to close the file. In the next chapter, we will look deeper into the inconsistencies in the footage, the missing frames, and the possible conflicts that may have taken place before Kendrick's disappearance from view. Because if the truth exists, it is buried not in a mat, but in the moments no one recorded. This is the beginning of the Kendrick Johnson investigation. And I, Miller Files, will keep digging until the silence breaks. There is a peculiar ache that comes with reviewing surveillance footage from a place where a tragedy occurred. As an investigator, I have spent thousands of hours staring into the mechanical gaze of security cameras, and yet every time I open such footage from a case like this, I feel the same heaviness, because cameras do not lie, but they often do something worse. They go silent. They blink at the wrong moment. They turn away, leaving only the faintest outline of the truth. In the Kendrick Johnson case, the cameras behaved exactly like that. They did not lie. They simply chose not to speak. When the official record stated that Kendrick walked into the old gym and never walked out, I expected the footage to guide me through every step. I imagined a clear sequence of movements: the opening of a door, the rustle of gym equipment, the familiar bounce of fluorescent light off the polished floor. Instead, I found gaps, large ones, moments that dissolved, like breath on cold glass. The system at Lowndes High School was a patchwork of old and new cameras, some pointing toward hallways, some toward stairwells, and only a few positioned in the gyms. The most important camera, the one closest to the mats, was positioned just slightly too high. It saw everything except what mattered. It caught Kendrick entering the general vicinity, but it could not see the precise place where his life supposedly ended. The cameras might as well have blinked. Whether it was coincidence or something else, I cannot say. But in investigations, coincidence is the laziest explanation for things that do not align. When the Johnson family obtained the footage, They invited experts to analyze it. I later interviewed two of those analysts. They walked me through the footage frame by frame. In one camera, you see Kendrick walking across a hallway at 1:28 in the afternoon. In another, you see students passing through the gym at around the same time. Yet the clocks do not match. One camera shows 1:28, another shows 12:57. A third seems to count seconds irregularly, as though time itself has lost its footing. I remember watching those screens and feeling as if I had been transported into a labyrinth built from digital static. Each camera recorded the world through its own clock, its own rhythm, its own broken sense of continuity. That would not be unusual in an old security system. But this was not just a technical issue. This was a timeline that could not be trusted. One of the analysts paused the footage near the moment. The school says Kendrick must have entered the gym alone. The analyst leaned back in the chair and said softly that the absence of evidence is often shaped more deliberately than the presence of evidence. I have reflected on that statement many times, because in the footage, there is a moment that should not exist. A moment when Kendrick disappears from view long enough for something to happen. Yet, nothing in the footage explains where he went or who else was in that gym. Silence wrapped around the boy like a curtain. When investigators requested more footage, they were told that the cameras in that area did not record continuously. They recorded in motion-activated bursts. But in a busy high school, motion is constant. Doors open, students move, teachers pass by. Even air currents can shift enough to trigger sensors. Yet somehow, the very moments when Kendrick should have been visible were moments when motion was apparently absent. The footage froze. Time stitched itself awkwardly and then skipped ahead. I visited the school years later. I walked the same hallway Kendrick walked. I stood exactly where the camera saw him for the last time. I let the hum of the fluorescent lights settle over my head. I tried to imagine what the camera would have captured if it had been honest. Perhaps Kendrick adjusting his books. Perhaps a fleeting smile to a friend who walked by. Perhaps the slight hesitation of someone realizing they forgot something in their locker. Normal things, human things, things that do not belong in tragedy. But what happened after the camera lost him is a void, and that void has shaped every question that followed. The school administrators stated that the gaps were normal. The sheriff's office stated that nothing sinister should be inferred from missing frames. Yet the family's experts insisted that the footage had been altered or selectively provided. When I asked the school district to explain the time-stamp inconsistencies, they said each camera operated on its own internal clock. That answer left me unsatisfied because even if cameras run on separate timers, the footage should still align through a centralized system. Here, it did not. Imagine reading a book where each chapter is printed in a different language, out of order, and with half of the pages torn out. That is what the footage felt like. I then began reconstructing the timeline of the 20 minutes between the last confirmed sighting of Kendrick and the discovery of something unusual near the mats. Not the discovery of his body, because that came the next morning. I mean, the moment students later recalled hearing something, seeing someone, or noticing the mats repositioned. These recollections were inconsistent, scattered, and sometimes contradictory. Memory is like that. It softens edges over time. But I made note of each statement, each loose thread. I followed them carefully, knowing they might never lead anywhere, but unable to ignore them. During those missing minutes, several students walked through the gym area. Some said they heard a thump. Others said they saw a shadow or movement near the mats, but assumed nothing was wrong. A few said they saw someone enter the gym after Kendrick, but they could not remember who. When I asked if anyone recalled hearing Kendrick shout or call out, the answer was always no. If Kendrick truly became trapped while reaching into the mat, his body would have been inverted, his chest compressed, his diaphragm restricted. Panic would have risen in his throat like fire. His voice would have strained for air. But whether he cried out or whether he could not is a question lost to the silence of that gym. As I reconstructed what might have happened, I returned repeatedly to the physical matter of the mats themselves. They were 6 feet tall when stored upright. The center openings were narrow. The mats were heavy. For someone of Kendrick's height to slide headfirst into one of them without disturbing the others stacked beside it, the positioning would need precision. Yet the photographs from the scene show minimal disturbance on the floor around the base. There were no scuff marks, no displaced debris, no signs that Kendrick struggled to climb or steady himself. When I stood beside an identical mat during my reconstruction, it towered above me like a column. I placed a shoe halfway down the interior, just as the official account described Kendrick doing. Retrieving the shoe would have required reaching deep into the narrow opening, leaning forward, balancing on the rim. It was not impossible, but when I attempted to lower myself into the mat, gravity took over immediately. My shoulders jammed within seconds. My ribs pressed against the foam. My breath shortened. It was a terrifying position, and I am an adult trained in crisis response. The idea that Kendrick would have slipped entirely inside so quickly without knocking the mat over or causing surrounding mats to shift is a scenario that deserves scrutiny. In cases like this, the physical evidence is the closest thing we have to the truth. But in this case, even that evidence has been complicated by time, by handling, by assumptions that harden too quickly into conclusions. I then turned my attention toward the students whose names repeatedly appeared in rumors and accusations. Rumors are dangerous, but ignoring patterns is even more so. Several students at the school had known conflicts with Kendrick in the past. Some were small disputes, typical teenage friction. Some were more serious, including an old altercation during a game. When I spoke to a former classmate, he told me that Kendrick was the kind of kid who did not go looking for trouble, but trouble sometimes found him because he refused to be intimidated. 2 brothers were mentioned more often than anyone else. Their father worked for the FBI. This fact alone created a storm of suspicion that has never fully dissipated. Officially, the brothers were cleared. They had alibis. They cooperated with authorities. The federal investigation found no basis to charge them. But because the investigation itself was perceived as flawed, the public has never accepted that answer completely. During one interview, a former student said something that lingered with me. He said that in a school as busy as Lowndes High, nothing happens without someone knowing. That statement echoed in my mind for weeks. If Kendrick was harmed by someone, someone else would have known. If he had an argument or a confrontation that day, someone would have heard. If he walked into the gym with another person, someone would have seen. And yet, no one came forward with definitive information. Silence swallowed everything. The deeper I looked, the clearer it became that the truth about those missing minutes is not just hidden by a lack of evidence. It is hidden by a fracture in the system that was supposed to protect Kendrick. The surveillance system failed. The preservation of the scene failed. The medical examination process failed. Each failure built upon the next until the truth itself became distorted. What happened in those missing minutes is not simply a mystery. It is the axis upon which the entire case turns. If Kendrick entered the gym alone, if no one followed him, if he truly acted without realizing the danger, then the tragedy is heartbreaking but accidental. But if someone else entered with him, if there was a conflict, if there was a moment of violence that cameras failed to capture, then the tragedy shifts from accident to something darker. And that is why I must continue digging. Those missing minutes are the doorway to either justice or permanent uncertainty. In the next chapter, I will examine the autopsy findings again, the contradictions between the first and second examinations, and the implications of a body returned without the organs that could have answered the most important questions. Because this case does not rest on what we know, it rests on what was lost. The truth often hides in a body long after a voice has gone silent. I have learned that in every case I have ever touched. Injuries whisper, bruises remember, organs speak in a language of pressure and hemorrhage and silence. But in the Kendrick Johnson case, even that language was stolen. By the time I reached the autopsy files, I realized I was staring at the remains of a story that someone had erased piece by piece. The boy was gone, and the body left behind had been muted. When the first autopsy report labeled Kendrick's death as positional asphyxia, I expected a document that supported such a conclusion clearly. Instead, I found a report that answered almost nothing. The official medical examiner described minor abrasions, a tongue slightly protruding, and discoloration consistent with inverted pooling. These observations were not unusual, but the absence of internal evaluation stood out more than the presence of any injury. The report felt rushed. It felt thin. It felt as if someone expected the conclusion before the examination even began. I remember sitting in my office, the autopsy file open in front of me, and feeling a kind of professional grief. Not sadness for the dead, though that was present. It was grief for the truth, because the truth had not been given space to breathe. When you handle death as often as I do, you develop an instinct for when an investigation has been underfed. This one starved. Months later, the Johnson family requested an independent autopsy. When the private pathologist opened the body bag, he froze. What he found inside became one of the most controversial elements of the entire case. Kendrick's internal organs had been removed. Not removed and reused or preserved for study. Removed and replaced with newspaper and stuffing. The heart, the lungs, the liver, the brain, the very organs that hold evidence of trauma, suffocation, struggle, all gone. The funeral home claimed that the organs were too decomposed to return after the first autopsy. The state claimed that the funeral home bore responsibility. The funeral home claimed the state mishandled preservation. Both pointed fingers at each other. Neither explanation restored the missing evidence. I visited the private pathologist in his small office outside Jacksonville. He was not a man prone to theatrics. He spoke carefully, measured, almost reluctantly, as if weighed down by the responsibility of the truth. He told me that what remained of Kendrick's body showed signs inconsistent with the official ruling. He pointed to a photograph of the jawline. He showed subtle bruising beneath the skin, deeper than the surface abrasions listed in the first report. He explained that such bruising could indicate a blow or the pressure of an object. Something that could have happened before death. Something that would not be caused simply by slipping into a mat. He told me the second autopsy revealed a circular pattern of hemorrhaging beneath the skull, a pattern suggesting blunt force trauma. Without the brain and other organs, the damage could not be fully evaluated, but the evidence that remained whispered a story of violence. I looked at the photographs for hours. I traced the shapes of the bruises as if trying to translate a forgotten map. If a blow occurred, it would have had to happen before Kendrick entered the mat. If it happened before, then the official account crumbled. There would be no reason for an injured boy to crawl into a mat voluntarily. The story would shift entirely. The private pathologist leaned toward me and said that the injuries he saw were more indicative of homicidal violence than accidental entrapment. He said that in his career he had seen asphyxia victims, but none from scenarios like the one described in the official narrative. He said something that stayed with me, that the absence of the organs was not merely an unfortunate loss, but a catastrophic mutilation of the truth. I did not know how to respond. There are moments in an investigation when you come face to face with a void so large you cannot fill it. This was one of those moments. Without the organs, time of death could not be properly established. Without the organs, internal trauma could not be mapped. Without the organs, the body could no longer speak. The sheriff's office defended the original findings, insisting that the second autopsy misinterpreted natural post-mortem changes. The state dismissed concerns as speculation. They said that decomposition explained the discoloration. They said that the replacement of organs was standard in some cases. They said that positional asphyxia was still the most logical explanation. Logic, the word, felt bitter. When I returned to the photographs for the third time, I studied the neck. The private pathologist had pointed out what he believed were signs of compressive force applied before death. It was not the deep bruising you see in strangulation cases, nor the patterned bruising seen in binding cases. It was subtle, a swelling that suggested pressure that could have been applied by an arm, a knee, a blow, or an object. The state had not acknowledged it. I imagined Kendrick in his final moments. If he was struck, he might have been disoriented. If he was pushed, he might have fallen. If he fell near the mats, he might have been dragged. But these were speculations, and without the organs, no scientific analysis could confirm or deny them. So instead, the official narrative remained simple. A boy reached for a shoe and suffocated. But simplicity is not the same as truth. In the weeks that followed, I reviewed statements from students, teachers, and staff. Some recalled seeing Kendrick earlier in the day. Some noticed nothing unusual. A few mentioned seeing him near the mats before. The recollections varied, but one theme repeated. No one reported seeing him retrieve shoes from inside the mats. No one reported this as a known habit. The assumption that Kendrick regularly stored shoes there came from a single anecdote that grew into a fact without ever being verified. One student told me that he had seen Kendrick jump over mats before, not dive inside them, not reach into them. He said, Kendrick was athletic and playful. That kind of movement made sense, but climbing headfirst into a vertical mat did not. I revisited the gym once more. I stood beside the mats. I listened to the echo of footsteps down the hall. I imagined the thud of a body hitting foam, the muffled sound of someone struggling to breathe, the impossibility of freeing oneself. Once gravity took control, I knew that someone trapped in that position would have only minutes of consciousness. But the autopsy suggested Kendrick had been in that mat far longer before death occurred. That contradiction carved another fracture through the official story. As the investigation progressed, the Johnson family's grief transformed into a determination that burned through every legal barrier placed in their path. They demanded federal intervention. They held rallies on the courthouse steps. They accused the sheriff's office of corruption and the medical examiner of incompetence. They believed Kendrick had been killed. They believed the investigation had been tampered with. They believe the missing organs were not an accident. Belief does not equal proof, but belief often points toward truths that institutions prefer to bury. The FBI eventually reviewed elements of the case. They reported no evidence of a homicide. They reaffirmed the sheriff's conclusions, but even within those findings, details were missing. The Bureau did not have access to the original organs. They could not redo the first autopsy. They could not reconstruct internal injuries that were no longer present. They could only review what remained, which was very little. This is what makes the Kendrick Johnson case uniquely tragic. It is not just a mystery. It is not just a conflict between two narratives. It is an investigation stripped of its backbone. Without organs, the body could not offer testimony. Without a preserved scene, the environment could not confirm events. Without continuous footage, the timeline could not be proven. Every pillar of forensic truth, every component that investigators rely on, had been cracked. As I reflect on the autopsy, I keep returning to one question: if Kendrick had been white, if he had been the son of a prominent family, if the school had responded faster, if the scene had been preserved, if the organs had been kept, if the investigation had not rushed toward closure, would the truth be known today? I cannot answer that, but the question itself reveals the weight of injustice. The third chapter closes not with clarity, but with recognition that the body left behind had more to say. It simply was not allowed to speak. In the next chapter, I will explore the social forces surrounding the case, the racial tensions, the growing public outcry, and the pressure that transformed this tragedy into a national controversy. The investigation is no longer only about what happened to one boy. It has become a question of what a community chooses to see and what it chooses to ignore. And I, Miller Files, am not done listening. There comes a point in every investigation when the truth stops belonging solely to the evidence and begins to belong to the people who believe in it. That point arrived early in the Kendrick Johnson case. Before the autopsy debates, before the missing footage arguments, before the accusations and counter-accusations, the town of Valdosta began to fracture under the weight of its own unresolved questions. A community is like a mirror. When something violent happens within it, the mirror cracks, and every person sees a different version of the truth reflected back at them. When I first visited Valdosta, I noticed how peaceful the town appeared from the outside. It was the kind of southern community where people greeted each other from across driveways, where church bells marked the rhythm of the weekend, where the high school stood as a pillar of pride. But beneath that calm surface was a tension that had been simmering long before Kendrick died. The town had long been divided along lines most people quietly pretended no longer existed. The case simply forced those lines into the open. When news of Kendrick's death spread, many residents accepted the official explanation without hesitation. They trusted the sheriff's office. They trusted the school. They trusted the institutions that had served them for years. To them, the idea that a teenage boy had died in a freak accident was tragic but believable. They did not see corruption or conspiracy. They saw misfortune. But to another part of Valdosta, a part that had long felt unseen, unheard, and unprotected, the explanation made no sense. They read the reports and saw the missing organs. They watched the footage and saw the gaps. They listened to the sheriff's conclusions and heard a story too convenient to be real. And in their eyes, the death of Kendrick Johnson was not just a tragedy. It was a symptom of a deeper illness. Racial tension does not always declare itself openly. It often shows up in sighs, in glances, in the way people lower their voices when speaking about certain families or certain institutions. I heard those quiet fractures during my interviews. Some residents spoke with certainty that the death was accidental. Others spoke with fear that if they questioned the authorities, they would be labeled troublemakers. And then there were those who were certain Kendrick had been killed and that the system was shielding someone. One man told me that in a town like Valdosta, power does not move loudly. It moves quietly, in favors exchanged and alliances built over years. When someone is connected to law enforcement or federal agencies, the community sees them through a shield of perceived authority. Whether that shield reflects truth or distorts, it becomes harder to determine. The Johnson family found themselves fighting not only for their son, but against the very institutions that were supposed to protect them. Grief can turn ordinary people into relentless warriors, and in this case, grief collided with fear, suspicion, and a long history of mistrust in a region where justice had not always been blind. The family took to the courthouse steps. They held signs bearing Kendrick's name. They demanded answers. Their voices echoed in the humid southern air. It was not just a call for justice. It was a declaration of defiance, a refusal to let the silence of the institutions swallow their son. I remember speaking with Jacqueline Johnson, Kendrick's mother. There was a fire in her eyes that no amount of grief could extinguish. She told me that she did not believe the official explanation for a single moment. She said that a mother knows when something is wrong, and she said that nothing about her son's death made sense. Her voice was steady, but beneath it was a storm. As the protests grew, the narrative began to shift. Local activists joined the family. National groups began to pay attention. Reporters from major networks descended upon Valdosta, and with them came the scrutiny that institutions fear most. Yet the more attention the case received, the deeper the town became divided. Those who supported the official conclusions accused the Johnson family of stirring unnecessary chaos. Those who believed the family accused the sheriff's office of incompetence or corruption. Conversations turned into confrontations. Social gatherings broke into arguments. Lines were drawn, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in shouts. One evening, as I walked through a quiet Valdosta neighborhood, an older gentleman motioned me over to his porch. He had been watching me interview people around town and said he knew what I was looking for. He told me that the truth in a southern town is never found in the open. It is buried beneath loyalties, fears, and debts. He said that if someone knew what happened to Kendrick, they would never speak unless their conscience outweighed their fear. And in Valdosta, fear was heavy. National pressure only intensified that fear. Commentators on television debated the case as if it were a sport. Some framed it as a racial injustice. Others framed it as an unfortunate tragedy exploited by those searching for scandal. But none of them lived in Valdosta. None of them walked its streets. None of them sat across from grieving parents or wary officials. They spoke from studios far away, building narratives that sometimes helped and sometimes harmed. As the case reached newspapers across the country, the town found itself thrust into the center of a national conversation about race, justice, and institutional trust. Some residents said the attention painted Valdosta unfairly. Others said it was long overdue. Meanwhile, the Johnson family stood in the storm, refusing to yield. The deeper I investigated, the more I realized that the truth of what happened to Kendrick could not be separated from the social environment that shaped the response. A case does not exist in a vacuum. It exists in a community, and the community of Valdosta was fractured long before Kendrick entered that gym. One moment from my investigation stands out sharply in my memory. I interviewed a teacher who had known Kendrick well. She described him as kind, gentle, and driven. She said he was the type of student who stayed after class to help put away equipment. But when I asked her about the days following his death, her expression changed. She said the school grew cold, not because of the tragedy, but because of the divisions it exposed. Some teachers whispered sympathy for the Johnsons. Others warned colleagues not to get involved. The administration maintained a rigid silence. She paused before telling me that the silence frightened her more than the tragedy itself. Communities often reveal their deepest truths in moments of crisis. Some protect the vulnerable. Others protect their own reputations. In this case, the silence felt like a shield, but shields can also hide wounds. As the months dragged on, more activists began visiting Valdosta. They organized marches, they held vigils. They demanded justice. But justice is not a single destination. It is a journey shaped by who is willing to walk it. And in Valdosta, many felt unable to take that walk. Others, however, stepped forward. They shared what they remembered. They shared what they suspected. They shared what they feared. Some accounts contradicted each other. Some were too vague to use. Some felt like fragments of a larger puzzle that remained incomplete. But every conversation revealed something more important. The town's uncertainty had hardened into unrest. When institutions fail to explain themselves clearly, people fill the void with their own explanations. Some are shaped by reason, others by fear, others by generations of mistrust. And once a community no longer agrees on the foundation of truth, justice becomes nearly impossible. By the time the case reached national prominence, I realized the investigation was no longer just about Kendrick. It was about Valdosta's identity, about how a community responds when tragedy meets controversy, about whether a town chooses truth or chooses peace, because the two are not always the same. In time, even the federal authorities felt the weight of the public pressure. Their involvement brought temporary hope, but their conclusion echoed the original ruling: no evidence of murder. The announcement rippled through the town like another fracture. For some, it was vindication. For others, betrayal. I sat with all of it: the documents, the interviews, the silence, the anger. The town divided not by a single death, but by the story told about it. A story that still did not make sense. As this chapter closes, the question that haunts Valdosta remains the same one that haunts me. If Kendrick's death was truly an accident, why did the truth fracture a town so deeply? And if it was not an accident, what force is powerful enough to bury the truth beneath so much silence? In the next chapter, I will bring all pieces of the investigation together: the footage, the autopsies, the social tension, the timeline, and I will reveal the possible scenarios that could explain Kendrick's final moments in the gym. Scenarios built not from speculation, but from everything the evidence and the silence have tried to hide. This is Miller Files, and I am not finished yet. The final stage of an investigation is never about certainty. It is about possibility. It is about standing in the intersection of everything known and everything missing, and deciding which direction the truth is most likely hiding. After months of retracing Kendrick Johnson's last movements, examining the gaps in the timeline, listening to the fractured voices of a divided town, and studying the evidence that remained after so much had been taken, I arrived at a place that every investigator eventually reaches, the place where the truth exists, not as a single narrative, but as a landscape of possibilities marked by shadows. When I returned to the gym for the last time, the mats had been replaced, the floor polished, the echoes of tragedy erased by new layers of everyday life. Students walked past the doors, the way they had years before, unaware that the building itself had become a monument to unanswered questions. I stood in the same place where Kendrick had once stood, letting the silence settle again. But this time, the silence felt different. It felt like a witness that had refused to speak, but not because it did not know the truth, because it knew too much. To understand what may have happened to Kendrick, I built 3 possible scenarios. Not fantasies, not theories born from emotion, but reconstructions grounded in evidence, interviews, and the failures of systems that left us with pieces instead of clarity. The first scenario is the one offered by the official investigation. Kendrick entered the gym alone. He climbed onto the mats to retrieve a pair of shoes. He slipped inside headfirst. His body became inverted. His chest compressed, his breathing restricted, and within minutes, darkness took over. In this version of the story, no one harmed him. No one saw him. No one heard him. His death was a rare, tragic accident that no one could have foreseen. As simple as it is, this scenario asks us to believe that a healthy, athletic teenager chose to reach into a deep mat in a way highly unlikely for his size and strength. It asks us to believe that he panicked silently, leaving no trace of struggle. It asks us to believe that a camera malfunctioned at the same moment he entered the gym. It asks us to overlook the injuries found in the second autopsy and the disappearance of his internal organs. It asks us to trust a chain of events that relies on too many coincidences. Coincidence is not impossible, but it is fragile. The second scenario suggests that Kendrick was involved in an altercation before entering the gym, an argument that escalated, a confrontation that turned physical. In this possibility, he suffered a blow to the head, perhaps unintentionally, perhaps not, disoriented or incapacitated. He was unable to protect himself, and at some point, he ended up inside the mat, placed there by someone hoping the scene would be mistaken for a tragic accident. This scenario aligns with some of the injuries noted by the independent pathologist, with the inconsistencies in the timeline and with the silence that followed. But this scenario asks us to accept that one or more students carried out a cover up inside a busy school without leaving clear evidence. It asks us to accept that no witness ever came forward, not even years later. Secrets do not remain intact for long when held by teenagers. Yet this secret, if it existed, has remained untouched. Fear can preserve silence, but silence of this magnitude is not common. The third scenario occupies the space between accident and foul play, a scenario in which Kendrick may have reached into the mat voluntarily, but not under ordinary circumstances. Perhaps he was being chased. Perhaps he was avoiding someone. Perhaps he hid in the mat, believing he could grab something quickly or conceal himself for a moment. Panic distorts judgment. Fear compresses logic. If something frightened him, even briefly, he might have acted without realizing the danger. In this scenario, no one physically harmed him, but someone may have indirectly caused the circumstances that led to his death. This scenario requires us to see the truth not as a single event, but as a chain reaction shaped by fear, confusion, and environment. It also leaves room for the injuries that cannot be fully explained, suggesting they may have occurred moments before entrapment, rather than as part of violence. All 3 scenarios are possible. None of them can be proven, and that is what makes the Kendrick Johnson case one of the most complicated of my career. As I looked over every detail again, I kept returning to a single thought. The truth is not lost because it is invisible. The truth is lost because it was never fully allowed to exist. Each failure in this investigation chipped away at it. Every missing frame from a camera, every mishandled piece of evidence, every decision made too quickly. Every silence that replaced a needed explanation. The truth did not disappear. It was dismantled. I met with the Johnson family one last time before leaving Valdosta. We sat in their living room, surrounded by photographs of Kendrick, pictures of his childhood, pictures from the basketball team, pictures of birthdays and holidays filled with life. His mother asked me whether I believed her son had been killed. It is the question every investigator fears, because our responsibility is not to comfort, but to be honest. I told her that the evidence had been damaged beyond repair, that the organs that could have answered her questions were gone, that the timeline had been fractured, that the scene had been compromised, and that because of those failures, the truth could be many things. She listened quietly, her hands clasped together. When I finished, she nodded and said something I will never forget. She said that a mother does not need an investigator to tell her what her heart already knows. As I left their home, I realized that my role was not to decide which scenario was correct. My role was to reveal the holes in the story, the unanswered questions, and the possibilities that exist in the space between known and unknown. Justice cannot be served on possibilities, but neither can it be denied by them. The case of Kendrick Johnson is no longer just a case. It is a mirror reflecting the weaknesses of a system that demands truth but is not always prepared to protect it. It is a reminder that evidence must be preserved with reverence, that questions must be examined without fear, that communities must face their fractures honestly. Before I closed the file on my desk, I wrote a final note. It said that the investigation should not end here, not because new evidence is guaranteed to appear, but because justice requires persistence, even when certainty is impossible. In the end, the question is not only what happened to Kendrick Johnson. The question is why so much of the truth was allowed to slip away. And until that question is answered, the case remains open, not only in the files of investigators, but in the conscience of everyone who has heard his story. This is Miller Files, and this is the truth, as close as we can reach it.